Egypt is interesting if they're in Psalm 83. Isaiah 19 talks about this whole downward progression of things going on from from Egypt. Bad things are going on. The economy's collapsing. There's a fishing industry. Everything's really bad. They're given over to a cruel master and this sort of thing. And we don't find out till verse 16 why. It starts off with the Lord flies in Egypt in a swift cloud. Okay, and then everything just starts to spiral downward for Egypt at that point to an entire collapse of the nation. And then it says in verse 16 there's terror from Judah. Matter of fact, we should probably read Isaiah 19. Can you get to Isaiah 19, verses 16 through 18?
Yeah, you bet.
And then I'll tell you what I believe is being said there.
Okay. Which verses you want me to read?
Isaiah 19, verses 16 through 18.
16. In that day, Egypt will be like women and will be afraid and fear because of the waving of the hand of the Lord of hosts, which he waves over it. And the land of Judah will be a terror to Egypt. Everyone who makes mention of it will be afraid of himself because of the counsel of the Lord of hosts, which he has determined against it. In that day, 5 cities in the land of Egypt will speak the language of Canaan and swear by the Lord of hosts. One will be called City of Destruction.
What you have here is we find out why Israel's falling apart, is there's terror coming from Judah. Now, Egypt has a peace treaty with Israel right now, just like Jordan does, right? But at some point, I don't believe this has happened yet, Egypt will become terrorized by Judah. They've been terrorized by Judah, and that's why they did the peace treaty between 1948, 1967, and 1973. So that fear upon Egypt has never been there until this point in time in modern history. And they have done a peace treaty with Israel as a result. But I believe when they're concerned about Damascus being destroyed and all these other countries coming together to take out Israel, making Jerusalem a cup of trembling, I believe Judah gets involved, Israel gets involved, and there's this terror going on. Ultimately, it looks like there's a war, because what happens is one of those cities that starts speaking the language of Canaan, which is Hebrew, because it sounds like Israel starts to move in a little bit into that territory, which is still part of the Promised Land. One of them is called the City of Destruction. Now, how did it get that name, right? I mean, I don't know. But Judah has got fingerprints in this one here, okay? So I'm saying, I believe there's 2 end-time judgments of Egypt that haven't happened yet. This one here, and then the Ezekiel 29 one where they go into 40 years of desolation. So this one wouldn't necessarily create a 40 years of desolation, because the Antichrist still got to get into Egypt. In Daniel chapter 11, he invades down into Egypt in end of Daniel chapter 11.
So let me throw this out there. This is like a bonus for all our viewers. What do you think the 40 years of desolation is? That is one of the most challenging prophecies to work through.
Well, it's interesting that Egypt had the Jews in bondage, the Hebrews in bondage for all that time, and then they had to wander, and the Hebrews had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. There may be some sort of a payback of some sort, I don't know.
Do you think that happens during the millennial kingdom? Or?
Yeah, I do, because if the Antichrist does this kind of desolation and is responsible for, and you have to read Ezekiel 29 to get a pulse of what we're talking about, that would be at toward the end of the tribulation. So Egypt would be desolated for a period of time into the Messianic kingdom.
Fascinating.
There'll be Edom will be desolated perpetually. It talks about Babylon will be forever desolated. It talks about too. So there'll be the Messianic kingdom it's not all just flowers and sugar and spice and everything roses. There's going to be some lessons learned from people. Desolated areas in Egypt, I believe, will be desolated for 40 years.
That's fascinating. But Israel will be like Eden.
Right.
When you look at the prophecies regarding the Messianic King, fascinating to talk about all these different things. I think you're bringing in some things that people have never heard before, never studied before, and just had different assumptions. So this is interesting.